every clock in this house.
The clocks in the house did not simply stop. They stopped together at the exact same moment, as if something unseen had reached into every mechanism, every spring and gear, and pressed its hand against time itself. There was no warning, no storm, no flicker of power, no sound of something breaking. 1 second, the house was alive with the quiet rhythm of ticking a soft, layered chorus that had existed for years, unnoticed and constant, and the next, there was nothing, just silence. A silence so complete, so sudden, that it didn't feel like the absence of sound, but like the presence of something else, something heavier, something that did not belong. And yet, in one room, behind a closed door at the end of the hallway, one clock continued to tick, slow, steady, unaffected, as if whatever had just happened had chosen not to touch it. The Hale house stood alone at the edge of a narrow road that most people no longer used, surrounded by trees that had grown tall and uneven over decades of quiet neglect. It was the kind of place that did not draw attention, not because it was hidden, but because it had always been there. It belonged to memory more than to the present. The wood of its walls had darkened with age, its windows carried faint distortions from years of weather, and its doors creaked not from disrepair, but from familiarity. Inside, everything felt preserved, not perfectly, but intentionally. Every object had a place, every room had a purpose, and every wall, without exception, held a clock. There were more clocks in that house than anyone could reasonably explain. Some had been passed down through generations, ornate, heavy, their frames carved with patterns no one remembered the meaning of. Others were simple, functional, placed in corners where they could be easily seen but rarely noticed. There was a tall grandfather clock in the hallway that marked each hour with a low, resonant chime, a small brass clock in the kitchen that ticked sharply, almost impatiently, a pocket watch long since broken that still hung from a hook near the door, kept not for use, but because it had always been there. Together, they created a constant sound, a subtle, overlapping rhythm that filled the house in a way that was almost comforting. It was never loud, never distracting, but it was always present. A reminder that time, no matter what else changed, continued to move forward. Eleanor Hale had grown up with that sound. She had never questioned it, never thought to count the clocks or consider why there were so many. To her, it was simply part of the house, like the smell of old wood, or the way sunlight filtered through the curtains in the late afternoon. Even after her father passed, leaving her alone in the house, she maintained them. She wound them carefully, adjusted their hands, listened for changes in their rhythm. It was not a task she had been asked to take on. It was something she did because it felt necessary, as if the house itself depended on it. On the day the clock stopped, nothing seemed different at first. The morning had passed quietly. The air was still, the light soft and steady. Eleanor sat at the table near the kitchen window, reading a letter she had already read twice before. The ticking of the clocks filled the background, as it always did, steady, predictable, unremarkable. Until it wasn't. She did not notice the moment it happened. No one ever does. The absence of sound rarely announces itself. It slips in quietly, replacing what was once there so completely that the mind hesitates before recognizing the change. But eventually, something felt wrong. A small shift in awareness, a sense that something familiar had been removed. She looked up. The house was silent. Not quiet silent. The difference was immediate, almost physical. It pressed against her ears, made the space around her feel larger, emptier, as if the walls had moved slightly farther apart. For a moment she remained still, listening, expecting the sound to return. It didn't. She stood slowly and looked toward the kitchen clock, 2:17. She frowned, stepping closer, as if proximity might change what she was seeing. The second hand was frozen, caught between two marks, as though it had been interrupted mid-motion. She reached out, touched the glass, half expecting it to start again. It didn't. She moved into the hallway, her steps quieter than usual, without the background rhythm to mask them. The grandfather clock stood tall against the wall, its pendulum still, its face unchanged. 2:17. Room after room, the same. Every clock she found had stopped at the exact same time. There was no variation, no delay, no sign of gradual failure. It was as if the entire house had been synchronized to a single moment and then held there. Except for one room. She did not go there immediately. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew, without needing to check, that something would be different. The room at the end of the hallway had belonged to her father. After his death, she had closed the door and left everything inside untouched. It wasn't a place she avoided. It was a place she preserved. Opening it felt less like entering a room and more like stepping into something that had already ended. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then she walked toward it. The handle felt colder than she expected. The door opened slowly, the hinges making a soft, familiar sound that seemed too loud in the silence of the house. Inside, the air felt different. Cooler, still, undisturbed. The curtains were drawn, allowing only a narrow strip of light to cut across the floor. Dust floated in the beam, suspended, unmoving. The furniture remained exactly as it had been, left the chair near the window, the bed neatly made, the small table beside it. And on the wall above the table, a clock. It ticked, softly, clearly, unmistakably. Tick. Eleanor froze. Tick. The sound was precise, measured, entirely unchanged by whatever had silenced the rest of the house. It did not hesitate. It did not falter. It continued, as if time itself had chosen this one place to remain intact. She stepped inside. Tick. Each step brought her closer to the sound, and with it, a growing sense that she was not simply hearing time pass, she was hearing something persist. Tick. She turned her head slightly, listening more carefully. For a moment, she thought she heard something else beneath it. Not another clock, not exactly. More like an echo. A second rhythm, faint and slightly out of sync, as if the sound were being reflected from somewhere deeper than the room itself. Tick. She looked around. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. The room remained still, preserved, untouched. Only the clock continued. In the days that followed, she tried to explain it. At first, to herself. She examined the other clocks, took them apart, replaced springs, cleaned mechanisms that did not need cleaning. Each time she set them again, each time she wound them carefully, they would begin to tick slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether they were allowed to continue. And each time, without exception, they stopped again. 2:17, it became a boundary, a line drawn across the house that nothing could cross. Nothing except that one clock. Over time, Eleanor stopped trying to fix the others. She let them remain as they were frozen, silent, fixed to a moment that refused to move forward. The house adjusted to the silence, but it never became normal. It was a different kind of quiet now. A quiet that held something inside it. Visitors noticed. They would step inside, pause, and look around with a slight frown, as if something felt wrong, but they could not say why. Eventually, they would notice the clocks. Why are they all stopped? She would hesitate. Because the answer was not something she could explain. Because saying it out loud made it sound impossible. Years passed. The town changed. The road became less traveled. The trees grew taller, their branches casting longer shadows across the house. Eleanor aged, her movements slower, her routines quieter. But the clock in that room never changed. It never slowed, never skipped, never stopped, even when the rest of the house fell deeper into stillness, even when dust gathered in places it had once been cleaned away, even when the world outside moved on without noticing. It continued. Tick, tick, tick. Sometimes, late at night, when the air was completely still and the darkness pressed gently against the windows, the sound seemed louder, not because it had changed, but because everything else had faded. In those moments, it felt less like a clock and more like a presence, something steady, something patient, something that existed independently of the life around it. And sometimes it didn't sound like just one clock. The idea came slowly, quietly, the way all unsettling thoughts do. At first she dismissed it, then she noticed it again. A slight overlap in the rhythm, a faint doubling of the sound, as if there were two, or more. Not visible, not measurable, just there, beneath the surface of the ticking. Years later, after Eleanor was gone and the house stood empty once again, the clocks remained exactly where they had been left. Every one of them still frozen at 2:17, except for one. People who pass by the house sometimes say they hear something when they walk near it at night. Not loud, not clear, just enough to make them pause, enough to make them listen. And if they listen long enough, they hear it tick. Steady, unchanging, unfinished. Because maybe the clock in that room is not measuring time the way we understand it. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's still counting something else.